The slap echoed through the gilded oak like a gunshot. John Cochran sat frozen, Rachel Smith's handprint burning red on his cheek, while his 6-year-old daughter, Laura, watched, her hand shaking as she gripped her breadstick. The woman in the red dress laughed, her voice full of hate as she stood over him like he was nothing. "What's wrong? Too weak to fight back? You don't even belong in a place like this." Every person in the restaurant looked away. Nobody helped, but something changed in John's eyes. Something cold, something dangerous, something that hadn't come out in 5 years, since he left the military. His hands, the same hands that braided Lara's hair and made her pancakes every morning, stayed perfectly still on the table. Rachel saw a loser in a cheap T-shirt. She didn't see the soldier. "Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you are tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel." 2 hours earlier, John and Laura had walked into gilded oak holding hands. Laura was wearing her favorite yellow dress with flowers on it. John was wearing jeans and a white T-shirt. He didn't own fancy clothes anymore. Didn't need them. His life now was simple. He worked as a security consultant from home, picked Laura up from school every day, made her dinner, helped with homework, and tucked her in at night. It was everything he'd wanted after years of war. Tonight was special. Laura had gotten straight A's on her report card. She'd been talking about this dinner for a week. She wanted to go to the fanciest restaurant in town. Wanted to feel like a princess. John had saved up for months to afford it. He didn't care that he looked out of place. Didn't care that people stared at his casual clothes. All that mattered was a smile on Lara's face when the hostess led them to their table by the window. The restaurant was beautiful. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, throwing light everywhere like diamonds. White tablecloths. Real flowers on every table. Classical music is playing softly. Rich people everywhere are talking about business deals and vacation homes. John felt uncomfortable, but Laura was glowing. She kept looking around with wide eyes like she'd walked into a fairy tale. They sat down, and Laura immediately started teaching him how to be fancy. She showed him which fork to use first, told him he had to put his napkin on his lap, made him promise not to talk with his mouth full. John played along, pretending he didn't know any of this already. He'd dined with generals and foreign officials during his military career. But Laura didn't know that. She only knew him as Dad, the guy who built furniture in the garage and made terrible jokes at breakfast. That's all he wanted her to know. They ordered. Laura got chicken fingers because even in a fancy restaurant, she was still 6 years old. John ordered a steak. They talked about school, about her best friend Emma, about the art project she was working on. Normal stuff, safe stuff, the kind of conversations John had fought wars to protect. This was why he'd left the military. This moment right here. His daughter was smiling at him across the table, without fear in her eyes. Then Rachel Smith walked in and everything changed. She entered like she owned the place. Red strapless dress that probably cost more than John's rent. Blonde hair perfectly styled. Diamonds on her wrists and neck. She was on her phone talking loud enough for everyone to hear. Something about closing a deal, about acquisition, market shares, and stock prices. She didn't look where she was going. Didn't care. Everyone else would move out of her way. Rachel's table was near theirs. As she walked past, still on her phone, John stood up to help Laura reach the dessert menu the waiter was holding. It was just bad timing. John turned at the exact moment Rachel stepped forward. His elbow bumped her arm. The wine glass in his hand tipped. Red wine splashed across her dress. The front of that expensive red dress was now stained dark with Cabernet. The restaurant went quiet. Rachel stopped mid-sentence on her phone, looked down at her dress, looked up at John. Her face twisted into something ugly. She didn't ask what happened, didn't give him a chance to apologize. She just reacted. The slap came fast and hard. Her palm cracked across John's face with enough force to make his head turn. The sound echoed through the silent restaurant. John's cheek burned. He tasted blood where his tooth cut the inside of his mouth, but he didn't react. Didn't move. Just stood there taking it because Laura was watching, and he couldn't let her see him be anything but calm. Laura started crying. Soft, scared crying that broke John's heart. She'd never seen anyone hit her dad before. Never seen him treated like this. John wanted to comfort her, but Rachel was already screaming. Do you have any idea what this dress costs? Do you have any idea who I am? Rachel's voice got louder with each word. People were staring now. Phones were coming out. You pathetic loser. You don't belong in a place like this. Look at you. A cheap t-shirt in the gilded oak. Were you raised in a barn? John took a breath, kept his voice calm and quiet. Ma'am, I'm very sorry. It was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning. Please, my daughter is scared. Can we talk about this calmly? Rachel laughed. Actually laughed. Your daughter? Oh, that's rich. What kind of father brings his child to a place like this dressed like a homeless person? What kind of example are you setting? She turned to the other diners as if she was performing. This is exactly what's wrong with society. No standards. No class. People like this think they can just show up anywhere. The restaurant manager appeared. A thin, nervous man in a suit. He looked between Rachel and John like he was trying to figure out who to side with. Rachel made the decision easy. She pointed at John and said in a voice everyone could hear that she was a regular customer who spent thousands of dollars here every month. She said if the manager didn't remove this man immediately, she'd make sure everyone knew the Gilded Oak allowed violent customers who assaulted women. John tried to explain that it was an accident, that she'd bumped into him, that he'd apologized and offered to pay. But the manager wasn't listening. He was looking at Rachel's expensive dress and her expensive jewelry and doing the math in his head. He asked John if it would be best if he and his daughter finished their meals somewhere else. Not demanding, just suggesting. But the meaning was clear. Leave or we'll make you leave. John looked at Laura. She was crying harder now. Her special night was ruined. All because a rich woman couldn't accept a simple accident. John wanted to argue, wanted to stand his ground. But Laura needed to get out of here. Needed to be somewhere safe where she could calm down. So John nodded. He asked for the check for what they'd already ordered. Rachel wasn't done. She stepped closer. Close enough that John could smell her perfume. She looked him up and down like he was trash and said that people like him were the reason places like this had to be careful about who they let in. She said he clearly couldn't afford to be here anyway. Said he was probably planning to skip out on the bill. Said she'd be watching to make sure he actually paid. Something in John snapped. Not physically. He didn't move, didn't raise his voice. But something inside him that had been sleeping for 5 years woke up. The part of him that had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan. The part that had led men through impossible missions. The part that had looked into the eyes of killers and never blinked. That part of him looked at Rachel Smith and assessed her like a target. He saw everything in half a second. Her pupils were dilated. Adrenaline. She was enjoying this. This wasn't about the dress. This was about power. About making someone feel small so she could feel big. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From excitement. She was filming him now with her phone. Documenting everything. Building a narrative. John realized this woman was dangerous. Not physically, but dangerous in the way that people with money and connections and no empathy were dangerous. She could ruin his life with a phone call. Could twist the story into whatever she wanted. Could make him the villain and her the victim. And there was nothing he could do about it without making things worse. So he did the hardest thing a man like him could do. He took the hit, swallowed his pride, picked up Laura and headed for the door. The manager brought the check. John paid cash. Left a tip even though the manager had just thrown him out. Because he wasn't going to give Rachel any more ammunition. Wasn't going to be the guy who made a scene or refused to pay or did anything that could be twisted into something worse. As he carried Laura toward the exit, Rachel's voice followed them. That's right. Run away. That's all people like you know how to do. Run and hide and blame everyone else for your failures. John kept walking, but he memorized her face, her voice, everything about her, old habits, the kind of habits that had kept him alive in war zones. Information was survival, and John had a feeling he was going to need every piece of information about Rachel Smith before this was over. John didn't make it to the door. Rachel's security guards blocked the exit. Two large men in dark suits appeared out of nowhere. They must have been dining at another table. Probably her personal security. Rich people like her didn't go anywhere without protection. The guards didn't touch John, but they stood in front of the door, making it clear he wasn't leaving yet. The taller one said Rachel wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding about what happened, that she wanted everything documented properly. John's stomach dropped. He knew what this was. This was her building a case, creating a narrative where she was the victim and he was the aggressor. Rachel came up behind the M, still holding her phone. She was recording video now, speaking clearly, as if she were narrating for a court. As you can see, this man has now tried to leave the scene after assaulting me and ruining my property. He's attempting to flee with his child before police arrive. I'm asking my security to please ensure he stays until authorities can take a proper statement. John wanted to scream, wanted to tell everyone watching that this was insane, that she'd bumped into him, that he'd apologized immediately, that she was the one who'd slapped him. But he knew the truth didn't matter. What mattered was who people believed. And a rich woman in a designer dress would always be believed over a guy in a t-shirt. He tried reasoning with the guards, told them his daughter was traumatized and needed to leave, told them he'd already paid his bill and had no obligation to stay, told them that if they physically prevented him from leaving, it would be a legal detention. The guards looked uncomfortable, but they didn't move. They were being paid to do what Rachel said. And Rachel was enjoying this too much to stop now. That's when one of the guards made a mistake. He reached for John's arm, just grabbed it to keep him from moving toward the door. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't violent, just a hand on John's bicep applying pressure. But Laura was right there, right next to where the guard was grabbing. And John's training took over before his brain could stop it. He moved without thinking, shifted his weight, rotated his wrist, applied pressure to the guard's thumb. It was a basic wrist lock, the kind of thing they taught on the first day of close-quarters combat training. The guard's hand released immediately, and he stepped back, making a surprised noise. John was gentle about it. Didn't hurt the guy, didn't escalate, just created space between the guard and his daughter. But Rachel caught it on camera, and she immediately started narrating a different story. He just attacked my security guard. Did everyone see that? This man just violently assaulted my employee. Someone called the police immediately. This man is dangerous. He's violent. His child isn't safe with him. The guard John had released was already talking, saying he was fine, saying it wasn't a big deal. But Rachel wasn't listening. She was playing to the audience now, telling everyone how frightened she was. This was exactly why she needed security, how she tried to handle this calmly. But now this man had shown his true colors. How was going to make sure he faced consequences? John's mind was racing. He knew how this looked, knew how Rachel's video would look without context. A man in casual clothes is physically engaging with security guards. His daughter is crying. Rachel is playing the victim. It didn't matter that the guard had touched him first, that he'd only defended himself and his daughter, that he'd used minimal force. All that mattered was the story. And Rachel was writing a story that ended with John in handcuffs. The restaurant manager was on the phone now, calling someone, probably the police. Other diners were recording too. Everyone had their phones out now. This was entertainment for them. Drama to talk about at their next dinner party. They didn't care about the truth. They just wanted to see what happened next. John made a decision. He couldn't win this. Not here. Not now. Not with Laura watching. If he argued, it would look defensive. If he fought, it would confirm Rachel's story. If he ran, it would look guilty. His only option was to cooperate completely and hope the truth came out later. So he set Laura down gently, told her everything was going to be okay, told her daddy hadn't done anything wrong, and this was just a big misunderstanding. She looked at him with those big scared eyes and asked if the police were going to take him away. He told her no, lied right to her face because he didn't know what else to do. 2 police officers arrived within 10 minutes. That was fast. Too fast. Rachel must have connections with the department. She met them at the door and immediately started her performance. Showed them her ruined dress. Showed them her video. Told them she'd been assaulted twice. Once by the initial wine spill, which she called a deliberate attack. And again, when John used force against her security guard. The officers listened to her whole story. Then they turned to John and asked for his version. John stayed calm, explained it was an accident, that he'd apologized. The guard had grabbed him near his daughter, and he'd simply created space. No one was hurt. He'd been trying to leave peacefully. The officers seemed skeptical, but they were listening at least. Then Rachel played her trump card. She said she wanted to press charges. Assault, destruction of property, whatever would stick. And she said she was extremely concerned about the child's safety. Said any man who would act violently in front of his own daughter clearly had issues. Said she wanted child services called to evaluate whether this child was in a safe environment. John's blood went cold. This wasn't about the dress anymore. This wasn't about her bruised ego. This was about her having complete power over him. She'd figured out his weakness. Laura, the one thing in the world he cared about more than anything. And Rachel was threatening to take her away. One of the officers asked if that was really necessary. Said the situation seemed like it could be resolved without involving child services. Rachel pulled out her wallet and showed them a business card. Said she was a major donor to the police department's youth programs. Said she had the police chief's personal cell phone number. Said she was sure the chief would want to know why his officers weren't taking a child's safety seriously. The officers' attitude changed immediately. They asked John if he could wait in a private dining room while they sorted everything out. Not under arrest. Just detained while they investigated. John knew he didn't have a choice. If he refused, it would look suspicious. If he demanded a lawyer, it would look guilty. So he agreed, asked if Laura could stay with him. They said no. Said it would be better if she waited with someone else while the adults figured things out. Rachel volunteered immediately. Said she had a friend who was a social worker dining at the restaurant tonight. Said the friend would be happy to watch Laura while this got sorted out. John wanted to refuse. Wanted to keep his daughter close. But the officers were already leading Laura away. She was crying and reaching for him and calling for her daddy. And there was nothing John could do except watch her disappear into another room with strangers while Rachel smiled. They put John in a private dining room at the back of the restaurant, told him to wait. One officer stayed by the door. John sat at the table and tried to think, tried to figure out how this had gone so wrong so fast. An hour ago, he'd been having dinner with his daughter, celebrating her good grades. Now he was detained by the police while a millionaire destroyed his life for spilling wine on her dress. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. John kept asking about Laura. The officer at the door said she was fine. Said she was with the social worker, eating ice cream. Said John should worry about himself right now. Finally, the door opened and a man in an expensive suit walked in, introduced himself as Rachel's lawyer. Said he wanted to resolve this quickly and quietly. The lawyer laid it out simply. Rachel was willing to drop everything. The criminal charges. The child services investigation. All of it. But John had to sign a statement admitting fault. Had to agree to pay for the dress and any additional damages Rachel claimed. And had to sign a non-disclosure agreement saying he'd never talk about what happened tonight. Oh. And the amount Rachel was asking for damages? $50,000. John laughed. Couldn't help it. He didn't have $50,000. Didn't have $5,000. He lived paycheck to paycheck, like most people. Rachel knew that. She was asking for an amount he couldn't possibly pay, which meant she didn't actually want money. She wanted him to refuse, wanted him to fight, because that would give her an excuse to follow through on her threats. John asked what would happen if he didn't sign. The lawyer said that Rachel would pursue criminal charges to the fullest extent, would personally fund the investigation, would use her connections to make sure the district attorney took this seriously, and would absolutely make sure Child Services did a full investigation into John's fitness as a parent. The lawyer said that even if John was eventually cleared, it would take months, maybe years. And during that time, Laura might be placed in foster care for her own safety. John sat there staring at this lawyer, this man, and who was threatening to take his daughter away because his client was embarrassed about some wine. And John realized he had one option left, one card he hadn't played yet, because he'd promised himself 5 years ago he'd never play it again, but they'd left him no choice. John asked if he could make one phone call. The lawyer said he wasn't under arrest, so technically he could call whoever he wanted. John pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts to a number he hadn't dialed in half a decade. Hit call. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, deep and commanding, the kind of voice that is expected to be obeyed. This is Colonel Brooks. Sir, it's Cobra. I need you at the Gilded Oak. Now. There was a pause. Then the colonel's voice changed, became sharper, more focused. Give me 20 minutes. John hung up. The lawyer asked who he'd just called. John smiled for the first time all night. My insurance policy. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. While John sat in that private dining room waiting for the colonel, Rachel was holding court in the main restaurant. She'd changed the narrative completely. Now she was the brave woman who'd stood up to a dangerous man, the hero who protected his child from a clearly unstable father. Other diners were buying her drinks, telling her how scary that must have been, how brave she was for pressing charges. The restaurant manager was apologizing profusely, offering to comp her meal, offering her a free dinner for next time, anything to keep her happy. Rachel accepted it all like it was owed to her, told the manager she appreciated that at least someone here understood customer service, unlike the staff who'd let that man into the establishment in the first place. Rachel's phone kept ringing. Her assistant, her PR team, her lawyers. Everyone wanted to know if she was okay, if she needed anything. Rachel loved every second of it. Loved being the center of attention. Loved having people ask if she was all right. This was better than closing a business deal. This was pure power. The ability to destroy someone's life with a phone call and have everyone support you while you do it. The waiter who'd served John and Laura approached Rachel's table. A young guy, maybe 22 years old. He looked nervous. Said he wanted to say something. Rachel smiled at him like a queen granting an audience. The waiter explained that he'd seen the whole thing. John had been very polite all night. That the wine spill really had been an accident. That Rachel had bumped into John, not the other way around. John had tried to apologize immediately, but Rachel had slapped him before he could even speak. The restaurant went quiet. Everyone was listening now. Rachel's smile disappeared. She asked the waiter if he was sure about what he was saying, if he really wanted to contradict her statement, if he understood what that would mean. The waiter swallowed hard but nodded, said he just wanted to tell the truth. John had a little girl, and it wasn't right to lie about what happened. Rachel turned to the restaurant manager, told him she didn't appreciate his staff calling her a liar. The manager looked panicked, started apologizing immediately, said the waiter was new, said he was obviously confused. Rachel said if this waiter was still employed here in 5 minutes, she'd never eat at the Gilded Oak again. She'd also make sure everyone in her social circle knew the restaurant protected abusers over victims. The manager didn't hesitate. Told the waiter he was fired effective immediately. Told him to clock out and leave. The waiter started to argue. Started to say this wasn't fair. But the manager was already walking away. Security escorted the waiter out while he protested. While he said he was just trying to do the right thing. Nobody cared. Nobody wanted to lose Rachel's business over some minimum wage kid's conscience. Rachel watched the waiter leave and felt satisfied. That was what happened to people who got in her way. They got removed. Simple, clean, final. She turned back to her friends and continued her story. Continued building the narrative where she was the victim and John was the villain. People believed her because they wanted to believe her. Because it was easier to believe that the poor guy in the t-shirt was dangerous than to believe the rich woman in the designer dress was lying. The social worker watching Laura came out to update Rachel. Said the little girl was very upset. Kept asking for her daddy. Kept saying she wanted to go home. Rachel told the social worker to note that in her report, the child appeared dependent on the father in an unhealthy way. That there might be signs of parental alienation or manipulation. The social worker looked uncomfortable, but she wrote it down. Rachel was paying for her kid's private school. The social worker couldn't afford to make her angry. Rachel's lawyer returned from talking to John. Said John had asked to make a phone call. Rachel asked if John was ready to sign. The lawyer said he didn't think so. Said John seemed weirdly calm for someone about to lose custody of his child. Rachel didn't like that. Didn't like that John wasn't breaking down. Wasn't begging. Wasn't showing the fear he should be showing. She told the lawyer to go back and make it clear this was a negotiation. John had 1 hour to sign, or she'd make his life a living hell. That's when the restaurant door opened, and Colonel Harrison Brooks walked in. He was in his dress uniform, full military regalia, medals on his chest, silver eagles on his shoulders. He was 60 years old, but he moved like a much younger man, carried himself like someone who commanded respect without asking for it. Everyone in the restaurant noticed him immediately. Conversation stopped. People stared. This was obviously someone important. The colonel walked straight to the restaurant manager, identified himself, asked where John Cochran was being held. The manager said held was a strong word, said they were just sorting out an incident. The colonel's expression didn't change, but his voice got colder. He asked if the manager was aware that John Cochran was a decorated veteran, a former Delta Force commander, a man who'd served his country for 15 years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The manager said he wasn't aware of that. The colonel said that it was obvious, because if the manager knew who John was, he'd have treated him with more respect. The colonel asked to see the security footage, the real footage, not Rachel's edited cell phone video. The manager said he'd already checked, and the footage had been corrupted. The system must have malfunctioned. The colonel smiled like he'd expected that answer. He pulled out his phone and made a call, said he needed a federal agent at the Gilded Oak immediately. Had reason to believe evidence was being tampered with in a case involving a military veteran. Rachel stood up from her table, walked over to the colonel, introduced herself, said she was a victim here, and she didn't appreciate the military getting involved in a civilian matter. The colonel looked at her like she was an insect, asked her name again. Rachel Smith, owner and CEO of Smith Technologies. The colonel nodded slowly, as if he was remembering something important. Then he asked if Smith Technologies was currently bidding on a defense contract, a $500 million contract to provide cybersecurity for military installations. Rachel's face changed. The confidence slipped for just a second. She asked how he knew about that. The colonel said that he was the final approval on that contract. His signature was the last thing needed before the deal went through. He'd been planning to sign it next week. But now he was having second thoughts. Because if Smith Technologies was willing to bully and destroy a veteran over spilled wine, what would they do with access to military secrets? Rachel's lawyer stepped forward. started saying something about how this was a separate matter, how the colonel couldn't use his position to interfere in civilian disputes. The colonel cut him off, said he could absolutely consider character and judgment when making contract decisions, said if Rachel Smith's judgment was so poor that she'd assault a veteran in public and try to take his child away, then maybe she didn't have the judgment needed for military contracts. The colonel pulled out a tablet and showed Rachel something. It was the real security footage. The footage Rachel thought had been deleted. It showed everything. Rachel is bumping into John. The wine is spilling. Rachel slaps John. John is trying to apologize. Rachel is screaming at him. The guards are blocking the exit. Everything. The colonel explained that John had contacted him the moment Rachel's security grabbed him. That contact had triggered an automatic backup protocol they'd established years ago when John was still on active duty, a protocol that streamed all nearby security cameras to a secure military server. The footage had been preserved before Rachel's people could corrupt it. Rachel tried to argue, said that the footage didn't show everything, that John had still attacked her security. The colonel played another clip, this one from a different angle. It clearly showed the guard grabbing John's arm first, showed John gently removing the grab using minimal force, showed the guard immediately saying he was fine. There was no attack, no violence, just a father protecting his space around his daughter. The colonel asked Rachel if she'd like to continue pursuing charges, because he'd be happy to provide this footage to the police, to the media, to every business contact she had. He'd make sure everyone knew that Rachel Smith liked to assault veterans and make false accusations. He'd personally call every member of the Defense Department and recommend they blacklist Smith Technologies, not just for this contract, but for all future contracts. Rachel would spend the rest of her career explaining why the military wouldn't work with her. Rachel's face went pale. She'd built her entire company on government contracts, military contracts, federal contracts. Without them, Smith Technologies was worth maybe a tenth of its current value. The colonel was offering to destroy everything she'd spent 20 years building, and he could do it with one phone call. She asked what he wanted. The colonel said he didn't want anything. John was the one who'd been wronged. John was the one who got to decide what happened next. The colonel walked to the private dining room and came back with John. Laura ran to her father and hugged him. John picked her up and held her tight. Then he looked at Rachel with those cold, tactical eyes again. John told Rachel she had two choices. Option one, she apologized right then in front of everyone, admitted she'd lied, admitted she'd bullied him. Then she left and never contacted him or his daughter again. Option two, the colonel released all the footage. The news would eat it up. Rich CEO assaults a veteran in a restaurant, then tries to destroy his life. Rachel's reputation would be ruined. Her company would lose millions. She'd spend years in court defending lawsuits. Rachel wanted to fight, wanted to argue, but she looked around the restaurant and saw everyone staring at her, saw their phones out, recording this moment too, saw the colonel standing there like a wall she couldn't get through, and she realized she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd picked on someone she thought was weak, someone she could crush without consequences. But John wasn't weak. He'd never been weak. He'd just been choosing not to fight. And now that he decided to fight back, Rachel didn't stand a chance. She apologized. It was forced and bitter, but she did it. Said she overreacted. Said the wine spill was an accident. Said she hoped John and his daughter could enjoy the rest of their evening. Then she grabbed her purse and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Her lawyer and her security followed. Her friends who'd been buying her drinks suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Within 5 minutes, Rachel was gone, and the restaurant was buzzing with whispers about what had just happened. The restaurant manager approached John and apologized, said he'd made a terrible mistake, said John's meal was on the house, said he'd like to hire back the waiter he'd fired if that would help make things right. John said he'd think about it. Right now, he just wanted to finish dinner with his daughter. They went back to their original table. The other diners gave them space. Some people nodded at John as he walked past. A few veterans in the room shook their heads, thanked him for his service, asked if he was really Delta Force. John didn't answer, just smiled and said he used to be in the military, but now he was just a dad trying to have dinner with his kid. Laura was still shaken, but she was calming down. John ordered her a new dessert, ice cream sundae with extra chocolate. She asked him why that woman had been so mean. John told her the truth. Sometimes, people who have money and power think that makes them better than everyone else. They think they can treat other people however they want. They forget that everyone deserves respect, no matter what they look like or how much money they have. Laura asked if the woman was going to come back. John said no. He said the woman learned an important lesson tonight, that you can't judge people by their clothes or their job. The man in the t-shirt might be stronger than you think. That being rich doesn't mean you get to be cruel. Laura seemed satisfied with that answer. She started eating her ice cream and talking about school again, already bouncing back the way kids do. The colonel sat down at their table, told Laura she had a very brave father. Laura said she knew. She said her daddy was the best in the whole world. The colonel smiled and said he believed it. Then he looked at John and asked if he was doing okay. Really okay. Not just physically, but mentally. John said he was fine. Said it had been 5 years since he'd had to think like a soldier. 5 years since he'd had to assess threats and plan tactical responses. It felt strange letting that part of him wake up, but it had felt necessary. The colonel said John had handled it perfectly, had stayed calm when most men would have lost control, had protected his daughter while still dealing with the threat, had known exactly when to call for backup and how to use the resources available to him. The colonel said John might have retired, but he was still a commander, still had the instincts and the training, still knew how to win battles. John said he didn't want to be that person anymore, wanted to just be dad. The colonel said he understood, but said it was good to know the commander was still there if John ever needed him. They finished dinner. The colonel picked up the check even though John protested, said it was the least he could do for one of his best soldiers. They walked out together. The colonel's car was waiting outside. He asked if John needed a ride. John said no, said he and Laura were going to walk to the ice cream shop down the street and pretend tonight had been normal. The colonel nodded, told John to call if he ever needed anything. Then he saluted, a real military salute. John hesitated, then saluted back. Old habits. The colonel left. T and John stood there holding Lara's hand, looking at the restaurant. He thought about what had just happened, how close he'd come to losing everything because some rich woman couldn't handle an accident, how easily Rachel had almost destroyed his life. The only thing that had saved him was calling in a favor from his past, a past he'd tried so hard to leave behind. John realized something important. He could never fully leave that past behind. The skills he'd learned, the connections he'd made. The man had been in the military. That was part of him forever. He could choose not to use it, could choose to be just dad. But when push came to shove, he'd always have that option, always have that power. And maybe that was okay. Maybe being a good father didn't mean pretending he wasn't also a soldier. Maybe it meant knowing when to be which person. They walked to the ice cream shop, a small local place with plastic booths and sticky tables. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. John ordered a cone. Laura ordered a cup with sprinkles. They sat by the window and watched cars drive past. Laura asked if they could come back here instead of the fancy restaurant next time. John laughed and said absolutely. He liked this place better anyway. A woman at the next table leaned over, said she'd been at the Gilded Oak earlier, had seen what happened, wanted to say she was glad it worked out. Rachel Smith had been coming to that restaurant for years and treating the staff terribly, that everyone was happy someone finally stood up to her. The woman said it took real strength to stay calm the way John did, to not escalate, to handle it the right way. John thanked her, said he was just trying to protect his daughter. The woman nodded, said he was a good father, that Laura was lucky to have him. Then she paid for their ice cream before John could stop her and left. John sat there looking at his daughter, eating ice cream with chocolate all over her face, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, not military pride, not the pride of completing a mission or winning a battle, just the simple pride of being a good dad, of protecting his kid, teaching her by example how to handle difficult situations with grace. Laura looked up at him and smiled, asked if they could do this again next time she got good grades. John said yes, but maybe they'd skip the fancy restaurant, stick to places like this where they could be themselves, where nobody cared what you wore or how much money you had, where the only thing that mattered was the ice cream and the company. Laura agreed, said this was way better than that other place anyway. They finished their ice cream and walked home. It was a nice night, cool but not cold. Stars are visible despite the city lights. John held Lara's hand and listened to her talk about everything and nothing, about her friend Emma, who could do a cartwheel, about the book she was reading in class, about whether they could get a dog someday. Normal kid stuff, the kind of stuff John had fought wars to protect. When they got home, John tucked Laura into bed. She asked him one more question, asked if he'd been scared tonight when that woman was being mean. John thought about it, told her the truth, said he hadn't been scared of the woman. He'd been scared of losing her, scared that someone might take her away. That was the only thing in the world that truly scared him. Laura hugged him tight and said nobody could ever take her away because they were a team. John said she was absolutely right. He kissed her forehead and turned off the light, stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her fall asleep, this little person who depended on him for everything, who trusted him to keep her safe, who thought he was the best dad in the world. John had faced enemy combatants and terrorist cells and impossible odds, but nothing had ever felt as important as this. This little girl was sleeping peacefully because she knew her dad would always protect her. John went to the living room and sat on the couch, pulled out his phone, looked at his contacts. The colonel's number was still there. So were dozens of other numbers. Men and women he'd served with, people who owed him favors, people he could call if he ever needed help. For 5 years, he hadn't looked at these numbers, hadn't thought about these people, had tried to pretend that part of his life didn't exist. But tonight had changed something, had reminded him that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes good people needed protection, that sometimes being a good father meant being willing to fight, not with fists, not with violence, but with strategic connections and the willingness to call in favors when necessary. John saved the colonel's number to his favorites, just in case, just so it would be easier to find if he ever needed it again. He hoped he wouldn't. Hope tonight was a one-time thing, an anomaly, but he knew better. The world was full of people like Rachel, people who thought power and money made them untouchable, people who would hurt others without thinking twice. And if John ever encountered someone like that again, he needed to be ready, not as John the furniture builder, but as Commander Cobra, the man who'd spent 15 years learning how to win impossible battles. John turned on the TV, found a basketball game, watched it without really paying attention. His mind kept going back to the restaurant, to the look on Rachel's face when the colonel showed her the footage, when she realized she'd picked the wrong person to bully, when she understood that the man in the T-shirt had more power than she'd ever imagined. John had enjoyed that moment more than he should have, had felt a satisfaction that worried him a little, because that satisfaction came from the soldier part of him, the part that I liked winning. I liked seeing enemies defeated, but he'd pushed that worry aside. He'd used his power responsibly tonight, had only done what was necessary to protect his daughter, hadn't gone overboard, hadn't destroyed Rachel even though he could have, had given her a chance to apologize and walk away. That was the right thing to do, the right thing to do. The soldier in him might have wanted more, might have wanted to teach Rachel a harder lesson, but the father in him had won. And that's what mattered. The basketball game ended. John turned off the TV, checked on Laura one more time. She was still sleeping peacefully. He went to his own room, got ready for bed. Tomorrow they'd go to the park, maybe have a picnic, do normal weekend things. Tonight would fade into memory, would become a story they'd laugh about someday. About the time some rich lady thought she could push them around and learned she was very wrong. John lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He thought about the waiter who'd been fired for telling the truth. Made a mental note to call the restaurant tomorrow. Make sure that kid got his job back. Maybe give him a good tip next time. People who stood up for what was right deserved to be rewarded, even when it cost them something. Especially when it cost them something. He thought about the colonel, about how quickly he'd responded, about how he dropped everything to help. John owed him. Would have to find a way to pay that back someday. But that was okay. That's how it worked in the military. You helped each other. You had each other's backs. And when someone called, you said yes without hesitation. John had done that for plenty of people over the years. It felt good to know people would still do it for him. He thought about Laura, about how resilient she was, how she'd bounced back from something that would have traumatized most kids, about how she trusted him to make everything okay. That trust was the most precious thing in John's life, more valuable than any medal or commendation, more important than any mission he'd ever completed. Being the person Laura thought he was. That was his real mission now, and he was going to do everything in his power to succeed. John closed his eyes and finally relaxed. Let the tension from the evening drain out of his body. He'd done what he needed to do, had protected his daughter, had handled the situation without losing control, had proven that you didn't need to be loud or aggressive to be strong. Sometimes real strength was staying calm, was making one phone call instead of throwing punches, was knowing when to fight and when to let others fight for you. The commander was still there, still part of him, but so was Dad. And John was learning that maybe he didn't have to choose between them. Maybe he could be both. Could be the guy who made pancakes and braided hair, and also be the guy who could dismantle your entire life if you threatened his family. Maybe that combination was exactly what Laura needed. A father who was gentle but not weak, kind but not powerless, normal but not helpless. John fell asleep feeling more at peace than he had in years. Tonight had been a test, a reminder of who he used to be and who he was now, and he'd passed. Had proven to himself that leaving the military didn't mean losing everything he'd learned there, that he could use those skills to protect what mattered without becoming someone he didn't want to be. That was enough. That was everything. Tomorrow would be a good day. They'd have their picnic. Laura would play on the swings. They'd feed the ducks at the pond. And nobody would know that the man pushing his daughter on the swing set used to be one of the most dangerous soldiers in the world. Nobody except the people who needed to know. The people who might think about causing trouble. They'd know, and they'd think twice. And that would keep his family safe. That was all John wanted, all he needed, the ability to be just Dad, with the option to be something more if the situation required it. The best of both worlds, the perfect balance. And tonight, he'd proven he could walk that line, could be both men at once, could protect his daughter without losing himself. That was victory. The kind of victory that mattered more than any military operation. The kind that let him sleep peacefully knowing his little girl was safe. Knowing tomorrow would be normal and happy. Knowing the dragon could rest. At least until the next time someone made the mistake of threatening what he loved. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel And let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. And here's what I need to know. Do you want part 2?